They expected marble skin, a queen preserved by time. What they found instead was a melted face of wax, red hair tangled in rot, and a stench so sharp it forced the men to their knees. When the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I was opened in Westminster Abbey in 1868, it wasn't reverence they discovered, it was horror. The lead coffin had failed, moisture crept in, and there, beneath centuries of royal stone, England's virgin queen had become something unrecognizable. Half bone, half sludge, crowned not with gold, but with the chemical remains of her own body. Her coronation ring was eaten through by fluids, her scepter darkened by mercury. The sculpted face, once meant to immortalize her power, had collapsed into a grotesque mask. She had ruled an empire, defied the Pope, and crushed rebellions. Yet in death, even her body staged a rebellion of its own. What the Victorians found wasn't majesty, it was biology. The nation that had once worshipped her beauty now faced her truth. Even monarchs rot beneath the velvet, beneath the symbols, beneath the myth. There was just a woman, melting back into earth, under the vaulted ceilings of Richmond Palace. In a room heavy with silence, England's last Tudor monarch clung to her throne. Elizabeth I, who had ruled for 45 years through war, treason, and plague, now sat motionless, draped in black silk, her breath shallow, her eyes unblinking. She refused to lie down. For days she stood, barely supported by cushions in the arms of ladies-in-waiting, as though yielding to the bed would signal death's final permission. Her doctors could do nothing. The swelling in her legs had worsened. Her hair thinned into brittle strands, and her throat swelled with an unseen infection. She could not swallow, could barely speak, yet she refused the priest, refused the bed, and refused the crown's surrender. She had watched too many die, too many buried before their time, and she would not join them, not without a final act of will. As the March winds scraped against the palace walls, she stood for hours in ghostly silence. Courtiers whispered beyond the doors, unsure if she was alive or already gone. Time bent around her as if history itself was waiting for permission to move on. When she finally collapsed into the cushions, no one dared to call it death until the physicians had confirmed it. Even then, the crown did not announce it immediately. Her body, though no longer breathing, remained seated in a room still ruled by her presence. It was March 24th, 1603. The Virgin Queen was dead, and yet the room felt no lighter. The immediate challenge was not political, but physical. Her body had begun to change. The swelling had not ceased, and the natural decay had already set in. There were instructions, vague ones, that she not be opened or desecrated in death. She had seen the fate of her father's corpse, Henry VIII, which had exploded in its coffin. She had known what had happened to her mother, Anne Boleyn, hastily buried without honor after her execution. Elizabeth had lived her life surrounded by the ghosts of dismembered royalty. Her fear was not just of dying, it was of what would happen after, but her requests would not be honored. The ritual of preserving a sovereign was too deeply embedded in Tudor tradition to be set aside. Her body was stripped and prepared, the royal surgeons performing what they deemed necessary. No ceremony marked the act, no choir sang. Instead, in a cold chamber away from courtly eyes, her abdomen was incised, the organs removed, and her body filled with aromatic compounds meant to stall the inevitable. Spices, herbs, resins, frankincense, myrrh, and cedarwood were packed into her chest cavity. Her face, once powdered with toxic white lead to maintain the illusion of youth, had been corroded beneath the surface. Layers of her skin had deteriorated under decades of cosmetics, leaving tissue raw and blistered. The royal surgeons attempted to rebuild her appearance using wax and plaster, shaping her cheeks and jaw to mimic life, not to preserve truth. A red wig, similar to the one she wore in life, was arranged on her head. The work was meticulous, but ultimately futile. Her face could not be saved. The mask they gave her was more theater than preservation. What remained of the queen was placed in a lead-lined coffin, sealed with bolts and rituals, and transported with care to Whitehall. A wax effigy was mounted atop the coffin, not out of vanity, but necessity. Her real face could not be shown to the public. This effigy, dressed in robes of state, rode through London atop the coffin as a nation mourned. Beneath it, her decaying body traveled in silence. The streets were lined with thousands. Bells tolled across the city. Clergy, nobles, and commoners moved together in one long procession toward Westminster Abbey. Behind the spectacle, however, the coffin began to betray its contents. The scent of resin could not mask the deeper, more primal odor of decay. Some heard strange sounds, faint hisses or moans, believed to be gas escaping from the sealed lead. No one dared speak of it openly. Inside the abbey, beneath the grand arches and royal tombs, her body was lowered into the vault she would share with her half-sister, Mary I. The two had fought, not just for power, but for the soul of England. One Protestant, one Catholic. Elizabeth had survived Mary's persecutions, had outlived her enemies, had forged an empire. And yet here, in the quiet dark of the abbey, their bones would rest together, stacked as if the wars between them had never mattered. The lid was closed. The stone was sealed. The Virgin Queen was entombed. But history would not leave her there. More than 2 centuries later, in 1868, during renovations under Dean Arthur Stanley, her tomb was disturbed. Curiosity had replaced reverence. The vault was opened under the abbey's floor. What they found was not imperial dignity, but something grotesque. Water had seeped through the stone. The lead coffins had buckled and cracked under pressure and time. The once pristine remains of Elizabeth had become a vision of royal ruin. The red wig, long since detached, floated in a puddle of viscous fluid. The wax face had melted into an unrecognizable form, its features distorted. Her bones, stained by centuries of chemical reactions, protruded from flesh turned to adipocere, a waxy substance born from a perfect storm of embalming chemicals, rich diet, and moisture. The coronation ring still clung to a finger reduced to sinew. The scepter had tarnished beyond recognition. What had once been crafted to signify eternity now stood as evidence of organic rebellion. The men who opened that coffin did not speak lightly of what they saw. Some refused to enter the vault again. The sight of a queen, once divine, now undone by biology, shattered illusions. The Victorian press treated the event with sensational restraint, yet rumors swirled in scholarly circles. Letters described the discovery in clinical horror. Stanley himself later requested to be buried in the simplest fashion possible, rejecting pomp. His experience in that tomb had changed him. Elizabeth had once declared she had the heart and stomach of a king. But hearts decay, stomachs rupture, bodies melt. No embalming technique, no royal privilege, no historical legacy could arrest that truth. She had become one with the stone of Westminster Abbey, her legend preserved not by flesh, but by the very horror of its undoing. The image of her melted mask, the red wig stained by rot, the ring eaten away by bodily fluids. These were the relics of power unmade. Her immortality had not been granted through ritual, but through decomposition. In death, as in life, Elizabeth ruled a spectacle. But the final performance was not the procession through London or the grandeur of her tomb. It was what happened after, in the dark, where no courtier dared look. Her body told a story the crown never intended. That decay is the final democracy, and not even queens are spared. The funeral procession stretched for over a mile through the heart of London, a spectacle choreographed not only to honor a monarch, but to reinforce the enduring power of the crown. Elizabeth's coffin, encased in lead and draped in purple velvet, moved slowly past crowds that had once cheered her name. Above it, her wax effigy stared blankly forward, adorned in the robes of state, her hands grasping the orb and scepter. The likeness was designed to evoke awe, to assert that even in death she remained sovereign. But inside the coffin, beneath the weight of ceremony and history, her body was already unraveling. The embalming agents had done their work, but only temporarily. Time, pressure, and chemistry were rewriting her legacy in flesh. The abbey doors opened to receive her. Westminster, the final resting place of England's kings and queens, had been prepared to welcome its most iconic ruler. She was lowered into the vault beneath the marble floor, directly above the coffin of Mary I. There had been no mistake. The symbolism was intentional. The Protestant queen who defeated Spain, who reshaped England's destiny, was now interred with the Catholic sister who once tried to burn her at the stake. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but rather an assertion of dominance. Elizabeth rested on top. Mary remained beneath. In the dimness of that subterranean chamber, centuries of blood and fire were reduced to silent layers of decaying bone. The vault was sealed, but not for eternity. In 1868, Dean Arthur Stanley ordered it opened as part of renovations within Westminster Abbey. What the men discovered beneath the stone slabs was not history frozen in time, but a royal crypt undone by moisture, neglect, and the irreversible process of decomposition. The air inside the tomb was heavy, foul with a chemical stench that clung to the walls. The coffins had corroded, water had entered, lead, though meant to preserve, had buckled under the weight of centuries. The remains of two queens had mingled not in spirit, but in physical collapse. Elizabeth's coffin bore the brunt. The red wig, dislodged from her reconstructed head, lay partially submerged in a pool of blackened fluid. The wax effigy's features had liquefied, transforming her regal visage into a mask of disfigurement. Her bones were stained deep ochre by the chemical stew within the coffin. Skin and tissue had turned to adipocere, a waxy substance formed under rare conditions of moisture and decay. This was no longer a body nor a mummy. It was a hybrid state, neither fully preserved nor fully decomposed, hovering in a liminal space between memory and biology. Her ring had fused to her skeletal finger, its gold eaten away at the edges by body fluids rich in acid. The scepter, once polished and precise, had bloomed with corrosion. The discovery left an impression beyond the physical. The scholars, priests, and workers who had seen her remains refused to speak in detail, but letters surfaced. Journals recorded hushed accounts. Stanley himself changed. His instructions for burial would later reject ceremony. He had seen what lay beneath history. The revelation of the Virgin Queen's final condition sparked debates across England. The image of a monarch decaying into wax and sludge challenged the narrative of Tudor immortality. She had once commanded storms, armies, and alliances. In the end, she was reduced to chemical reaction. The decomposition had its reasons. The embalming practices of the time, though advanced for their day, could not withstand the natural intrusions of water and air over 265 years. The presence of lead and mercury within her body accelerated a unique breakdown. The cosmetic lace she wore for decades compounded the toxicity. The rich diet of a monarch, high in fats and sugars, created the ideal conditions for adipocere formation. This transformation, known as saponification, rendered her body less like a relic and more like a cautionary tale. Historians would later analyze the process in clinical terms, but those who saw it firsthand described it as haunting, not because it was grotesque, but because it was undeniably human. This moment marked a shift. Royal burials, once orchestrated to project eternal dignity, now faced scrutiny. Queen Victoria, upon learning the details, issued reforms. No more wax faces, no more excessive perfumes or theatrical embalming. The body of Elizabeth I had exposed the fragility behind centuries of statecraft. Her death and the unintended aftermath had unveiled a truth too vast for myth to contain. Her corpse was no longer a symbol of divine rule. It was evidence. She had died as all do, and what remained was subject to time, rot, and reaction. And yet, there was something profound in her undoing. Stripped of regalia, stripped of ceremony, what remained was not failure but completion. The Virgin Queen, who had stood as an emblem of independence, who had refused to marry or cede power, had returned to the earth without apology. Her final legacy was not in her tomb's grandeur or in her titles, but in the way her body told the truth. Power fades, beauty corrodes, legends crumble, but in decomposition, Elizabeth achieved what few monarchs ever do. She became real. The vault was resealed. No further intrusions would be permitted. Elizabeth and Mary now rested together, the war between them dissolved by biology. The abbey floor was restored. Tourists would walk above, unaware of the silent lesson beneath their feet. The woman who once declared she would never be ruled had been reduced to dust and wax, but in doing so, had claimed a final kind of victory. She had exposed the lie behind immortality, and in her undoing, revealed something greater than myth. The aftermath of Elizabeth's disturbed tomb extended far beyond the crypt. News of the discovery spread slowly at first, whispered through private letters, then picked up by antiquarians, and the circles of London's historical societies. Public knowledge remained limited. Those who had witnessed the state of the vault chose silence over spectacle, but the implications were seismic. What had been found beneath Westminster Abbey forced a confrontation with the physicality of monarchy. It dismantled illusions, crafted not just by Elizabeth's own image-making, but by centuries of curated royal myth. Inside court circles, the discovery was treated with discretion, but the psychological toll lingered. The crown had always presented itself as a lineage of divine right, each monarch anointed not only by ceremony, but by sacred continuity. That continuity had relied on symbols: the robes, the scepters, the state funerals, the immaculate tombs. Elizabeth's body, chemically mutated, melted and visibly violated by time and environment, shattered that chain. It didn't matter how many banners had been raised in her honor or how many theaters bore her name. She had disintegrated. The lead seal had not preserved her. The wax face had collapsed. The royal body, once meant to transcend death, had betrayed the illusion. There were consequences beyond symbolism. The Church of England, deeply entwined with monarchy, saw in this event a crisis of presentation. Death was sacred, but burial was political. In Elizabeth's case, it had become grotesque. The public, increasingly literate and aware of science, began questioning the purpose of elaborate funerary rituals. Embalming, once seen as respectful, now appeared as a prelude to horror. The practice of sealing monarchs in lead-lined coffins with elaborate preservatives was no longer regarded with reverence. The physical evidence of its failure in Elizabeth's tomb catalyzed reforms. Future royal deaths were handled differently, less dramatic, less theatrical, more clinical. Queen Victoria took the matter seriously. She had always seen herself as a descendant in Elizabeth's tradition, a woman reigning alone, commanding an empire without a king beside her. The details from the vault reached her in fragments, through letters from the Dean, through reports written in passive, cautious tones. But they were clear enough. The body of her forebear had decayed in ways that bordered on indignity. There was no way to reconcile that image with the propaganda of timeless majesty. Victoria issued private orders that future monarchs should be interred in ways that emphasized dignity over display. The Victorian obsession with death, so ornate, so steeped in memento mori, found its limits at the edge of biological truth. The academic world, meanwhile, approached the discovery with the language of pathology. They studied the state of the tomb, the failure of materials, the role of moisture, the chemical interplay of embalming agents and body fat. Journals published theories on why Elizabeth's body had turned to adipocere, how the unique conditions of the vault and the embalming techniques of 1603 had created a slow chemical event unlike ordinary decomposition. But beyond the science, there remained a discomfort, a sense that something sacred had been breached. It wasn't merely that a queen had rotted. It was that the rot had left behind an image more lasting than any statue. In art and popular culture, Elizabeth had always been rendered as untouchable. The white face, the stiff lace collar, the crown set perfectly in place. These were the icons of empire, purity, power. But the vision from her coffin was irreversible. The wax features had melted unevenly, creating the impression of a scream frozen in collapse. The red wig had darkened with damp. Her skeleton, once upright in tapestries and portraits, now slumped amid dissolved fabric and discolored regalia. The orb and scepter, those instruments of state, had corroded like neglected tools. These were not metaphors. They were facts, witnessed by men who would not speak of them again. No one would say it aloud, but Elizabeth's final state had unsettled the monarchy's claim to myth. Power had always relied on distance. The distance between ruler and subject, between life and death, between symbol and reality. Her corpse had collapsed those distances. What had been found was not a saint, not a sovereign, but a body responding to heat, air, water, and time. The very substances that had once granted her beauty, white lead, cinnabar rouge, mercury tonics, had become poisons in death, accelerating the body's undoing. Her vanity, like her virtue, had decayed. Still, there was a kind of poetry in what remained. The woman who had refused marriage, who had ruled without heirs, who had chosen image over intimacy, was now beyond recognition. She had given herself to England completely, and England, through time, had taken her back. The abbey stone above her tomb bore no scars from the opening, Tourists passed by unaware, lighting candles, snapping photos, pausing at plaques. They remembered her reign, not her remains. But beneath that calm, the story persisted, not as scandal, not as secret, but as evidence. The legend had faded into chemistry. Her legacy endured in different ways. Elizabeth I remained on currency, in classrooms, in literature. But the version that had been unsealed in 1868 lived only in a handful of journals and memories. It was not a chapter fit for ceremony. And yet, it was perhaps her most honest. Every monument built to resist time eventually yields. In the end, she had joined not just her sister Mary, but every subject she had once ruled. Indistinct, returned to the earth, claimed by forces no crown can command. The spectacle of royal decay left a silence that echoed beyond Westminster. Though no official proclamation followed the rediscovery, the monarchy shifted its gaze inward. The Queen's body had failed its narrative. This was not a martyr, not a symbol of divine permanence preserved for eternity. This was a corpse, volatile, altered, grotesque in a way no artist could have painted. Elizabeth had governed with myth, constructed a persona built from symbols and silences, refusing marriage, cloaking herself in virginity, power, and divine favor. But under the abbey stones, the truth was no longer metaphorical. Her body, riddled with the aftereffects of chemical preservation, had resisted nothing. Flesh and fiction had come undone together. The physical remnants, a disfigured wax mask, a corroded coronation ring, a tangle of reddish fibers once known as royal hair, were not collected as relics. They were not archived, preserved, or mounted in display. They were sealed again in the lead that had failed her once already. There was no appetite for spectacle. To view the Queen as she had become was to see the end of a system that believed itself exempt from time. For centuries, royalty had projected stability through the image of the eternal body. Elizabeth's degradation interrupted that fiction. The imagery didn't survive contact with air and exposure. It decomposed along with her. For those close to the church, the discovery stirred theological unease. The remains of saints were supposed to resist decay, to persist miraculously through centuries as proof of divine favor. Elizabeth, though not canonized, had often been likened to a sacred figure by Protestant reformers. Her body, stripped of nobility by rot and fluid, mocked at comparison. She was not untouched by time or nature. She was not above the processes that governed all organic things. Her death became physical evidence of spiritual equality. To the faithful, it was humbling. To the institution, it was destabilizing. There was also discomfort within political circles. The image of Elizabeth as England's sovereign cornerstone, long immortalized in paintings, plays, and textbooks, now bore an invisible asterisk. Her state funeral, her marble effigies, her speeches engraved in the cultural memory, they all sat atop a final truth that was wet, acidic, irreversible. No chronicle of Tudor glory could fully ignore what had happened in that crypt. Writers knew, but chose omission. Portraits remained untouched. Schoolchildren still studied the Spanish Armada, the Elizabethan Golden Age, the flourishing of drama and sea power. But beneath the abbey, the Queen had collapsed into chemistry. There was no glory in the smell of ammonia and fat decay. Among historians, there was debate over what should be done. Some advocated full documentation, sketches, chemical analysis, preservation studies. Others insisted the tomb be closed, and the findings locked in archives. Ultimately, discretion prevailed. The men who had entered the crypt did not publish details in public papers. The fear was not only of offense, but of undermining the very concept of historical majesty. To discuss Elizabeth's corpse openly would have pierced too many illusions at once. It would have made memory material, tangible, vulnerable. Still, the event had its consequences. Later generations of royals were buried differently. Materials used in preservation changed. Lead was still used, but with modifications. Embalming was adjusted to anticipate not just decomposition, but exposure. The possibility that a body could be exhumed, whether in an emergency or by curiosity, now informed the handling of royal remains. The body had to remain presentable indefinitely. Elizabeth's undoing became the model for prevention, yet the lesson was never printed. It lived in murmurs, in shifts of policy, in the quiet redirection of state ritual. The monarchy, perhaps unconsciously, began to distance itself from the Baroque. Victoria's own burial, and those after her, moved away from the theatricality of Tudor and Stuart funerals. Even the language of death softened, resting, past, gone to join the ancestors. The brutal finality witnessed in the Abbey was not suited to public digestion. It stayed behind the veil, but the transformation of Elizabeth's body, beyond its horror, also testified to something elemental. The queen who had turned herself into a myth had not escaped the earth's pull. Her body spoke in its silence. No crown, no portrait, no tapestry could forestall the cellular end. It did not matter that she had defied the Pope, defeated the Spanish, outlived plots and poison. Under the ground, she was made equal. She was not betrayed by her physicians or her court. She was reclaimed by physics, biology, time. And in that return, there was an odd kind of justice. Elizabeth had denied the natural order in life, never marrying, never mothering, never surrendering. She existed above the role of woman, queen, subject. Her reign was a rejection of submission. But in death, she was claimed without protest. The stone did not care for policy. The moisture did not respect lineage. The gas that swelled in her sealed coffin had no regard for legacy. She was undone not by scandal, but by nature. And nature is the most indifferent power of all. In this way, the Virgin Queen achieved what no narrative had offered her, an ending without mythology. Her decay stripped away the artifices, the politics, the godlike framing. All that remained was evidence of a woman who had lived and died and returned to the matter from which she had come. No monument can outlast that truth. No effigy can erase it. Under the Abbey, Elizabeth became not just the end of a dynasty, but the measure of mortality itself. Beneath the polished surface of Westminster Abbey, where tourists tread softly over memorials to kings, poets, and generals, the earth tells a different story. Elizabeth I, once robed in velvet and surrounded by the language of triumph, now lay in silence, not just beside her sister, but inside an ecosystem of irreversible change. Her body, once intended to signify the permanence of power, had become a part of the ancient floor itself. The fabric of her coffin had dissolved into its surroundings. The chemical imprint of her embalming had leached into the stone. In this resting place, she did not rule. She disappeared. Above, England moved on. The industrial age advanced. Crowns passed. Wars began and ended. New monarchs reigned, each projecting dignity in line with modern tastes. Yet no sovereign could fully escape the shadow of that quiet truth sealed below. The Virgin Queen, whose myth had outlived her century, had finally met the same ending as the subjects who once sang her praises. It was not a fall from grace, but a slow fading into geological time. She was no longer an individual. She was a presence, embedded in the mineral and biological processes of decay. The Abbey did not preserve her. It absorbed her. That transformation marked a rupture in how history itself was imagined. In the past, rulers were made eternal through marble statues and grand tomb inscriptions. Their bones, if they survived at all, were preserved as sacred tokens, touched only by the hands of faith or lineage. But Elizabeth's decomposition reminded even her most devoted chroniclers that history does not reside in flesh. It resides in memory, and memory, like tissue, deteriorates. Every fact can erode. Every image can blur. Even names etched in gold can be worn away by water and time. The paradox of her posthumous state was that she had never been more human. In life, she had cloaked herself in ritual and language that separated her from the masses, speaking of herself in plural, choosing virginity as a political weapon, avoiding marriage to remain the sole embodiment of England itself. But in death, all that separation vanished. Her body followed the same course as every other. Her organs liquefied, her skin transformed, her crown corroded. There was no royal exception to entropy. Yet, something else lingered, not in the waxen mask that had melted under pressure, nor in the red hair that no longer framed a face. It lingered in the impact she had on the nation's imagination, in the knowledge that she had once stood alone against tides foreign and domestic, and in the discomfort that even such singularity could not be embalmed forever. Her remains did not scandalize history. They clarified it. They grounded it in biology and soil, reminding a nation obsessed with myth that even its most towering figures were made of flesh. As the decades passed, the memory of the 1868 vault opening faded into institutional reticence. No public tours of the crypt were offered. No plaque mentioned the event. The archives held whispers, letters, descriptions without photographs. The men who saw her remains never published their accounts in full. The silence was intentional, not out of shame, but reverence for the fragile illusion that monarchy must be larger than death. But that illusion had already cracked. Every royal funeral that followed carried that unspoken inheritance. Coffins were sealed more carefully. Embalming methods were altered to reduce chemical reaction. Burial environments were re-engineered to prevent exposure to groundwater or shifting stone. Future monarchs would be remembered not just for their titles but for how they might decompose. Behind every coronation stood the knowledge that one day, under the abbey, or beyond it, their flesh would follow Elizabeth's. In literature, Elizabeth remained untouched. She stood in portraits and plays, painted as an eternal figure of wisdom and defiance. But the abbey's vault contradicted the frame. The red of her wig, the glisten of her regalia, the sculpted pose, all had succumbed to moisture and gas. The very symbols that had defined her reign had become unstable in death. Her orb, meant to signify global dominion, had dulled. The gold threads of her burial garments unraveled in dampness. The scent of spices, once meant to veil the truth, had long since surrendered to the odor of time. Yet her greatest monument was not architectural. It was existential. She showed that even a woman who had outwitted papal decrees, dissolved foreign alliances, and held firm against internal rebellion, could not escape the common fate. Her uniqueness did not prevent her from joining the anonymous procession of the dead. In that way, she achieved something no ruler ever sought: to be known in full, not just as an icon, but as a body reclaimed. She became, perhaps unintentionally, the most democratic of sovereigns. Her decay did not mock her greatness, it completed it. It removed the last barrier between ruler and ruled. What the eye never saw in portraits, wrinkles, sickness, physical vulnerability, was laid bare in what remained. There was no escaping it. No veil could cover it. No protocol could reverse it. Today, tourists walk the flagstones above her tomb, passing over centuries of power now dissolved beneath their feet. They photograph plaques. They whisper at effigies. But below them lies a silence deeper than reverence, a reminder that history is not written only in victories or declarations. It is written in the chemistry of endings. And under Westminster, Elizabeth I left a final declaration, one that no parchment ever recorded and no courtier ever spoke aloud. She became not a ghost, but an element, not a myth, but a substance, not a queen forever, but a woman at last. The silence that settled after the vault was resealed carried more weight than any royal decree. It was not the kind of silence born from respect or ceremony, but from something heavier, an awareness that even legend is subject to erasure. Elizabeth I had shaped the fate of an empire, turned herself into a living emblem, and walked the world like a myth sculpted in bone and velvet. But her final state, unintentional and uncelebrated, left an impression no pageantry could override. She did not ascend beyond mortality. She was absorbed by it. The remains once intended to inspire awe now spoke to the inevitability of collapse. No monument, however grand, can truly carry the weight of a human life. In Elizabeth's case, her body could not even carry the full shape of her story. The wax face melted, the regalia decayed, her bloodline ended with her, and even her flesh refused preservation. That refusal, unspoken but absolute, became her last act, not of defiance, but of truth. She had governed a nation through illusion. Glittering portraits, speeches steeped in theatricality, a court trained to obey appearances. But the tomb offered no illusions, only chemistry, only time. There is a peculiar kind of clarity in that ending. Not tragedy, not failure, but revelation. The state could not stop what the body had always known. Her legacy would not be held in stone, or in the remnants of wax and cloth. It would live in what survived decay, the consequences of her reign, the questions her image continues to provoke, the contradiction between the myth she built and the material she left behind. Elizabeth's afterlife is not one of divine glow or suspended glory. It is a quiet, irreversible merging with earth, with moisture, with absence. That merging tells us more about the nature of power than any coronation. In life, she claimed an identity beyond marriage, beyond dynasty, beyond her own gender. In death, She gave that identity back to the processes that claim everyone. She was not spared. She was not exempt. The coffin collapsed. The face dissolved. The organs returned to matter. And yet, the story deepened, not despite the rot, but through it. Her final lesson is not one of victory or defeat, but of perspective. For all the efforts to immortalize, to entomb authority in lead and ritual, the outcome is always elemental. Even for queens, there is no immunity from biology. The body is the last, most honest storyteller, and in the end, it told hers without mercy. She remains beneath the abbey, unseen, unspoken, unnamed in the tourist maps. But in her silence lies the closing chapter of a reign that refused to end cleanly. Elizabeth I did not disappear into perfection. She became part of the floor itself, part of the gravity that holds the cathedral still. Not a statue, not a relic, but something more enduring, something real, something real.